There are always so many fun new watercolor supplies or even non-watercolor supplies that you can incorporate into your watercolors that sometimes you just have to try them. And that was the case when I found Brusho Crystal Colors, which is just a powdered pigment. And it's usually a blend of pigments to get the color that it says it is. So in this painting, we're using yellow and black. And by this painting, I mean this painting. So in this video, obviously, we're talking about Brusho, but we're also going to talk about color, positive and negative shapes, and hard and soft edges. So whether or not you follow along and paint this one with me, or use what we go over to apply it to your own art, I think you're gonna have a lot of fun. I do want to give you a little bit of a heads up that this painting was challenging. It was harder than I anticipated, but a ton of fun. I ended up learning a lot and well worth it, absolutely. So let's dive in. The reference photo and the tracing for this painting are in the description. Before I started painting, I made myself some notes. I'm talking about kind of the techniques I wanted to use to depict different areas of the lizard. I talked about how I kind of wanted to tackle it in order of the steps that I wanted to do. And I also made sure to plan out my colors. Talking more about color, the use of Brusho in this painting is here and here. You've probably heard me say less is more, and that also applies to Brusho. If you put Brusho everywhere, it's just going to lose its impact. I started out this painting by tracing it onto my full-size paper. It is 300-pound cold press. And of course, if you're curious about the paints and the paper and the brushes that I love to use, you can find all that information at paint333.com. The first thing I'm painting on Liz is her eye. I'm following my 3-step process for most of this painting. Painting with water, dropping in color from dark to light, and then finishing with texture techniques. Now the thing about the 3-step process is that you often do it over and over again, both section by section and layer by layer. So yes, it's 3 steps, it helps you remember what to do, but you'll have to do it multiple times. You can see my palette here. I'm using a lot of buff titanium, a lot of neutral tint. The warm colors are Azo Yellow, Quinacridone Gold, and Wild Fuchsia / Rich Opera. And then my purple is a mix of that Wild Fuchsia Rich Opera color with Ultramarine Blue. I ended up spending a lot of time on the iris of Liz, making sure I had the Quinacridone Gold around the edges next to the neutral tint. And then in the center, very close to the pupil, is the Azo Yellow. So basically, I was kind of going back and forth between adding water to push the Quinacridone Gold pigment to the edges. So if your paint is still wet and it's a big area of Quinacridone Gold and you drop plain water into it, it will push the pigment. And then I was alternating that with kind of waiting for it to dry and lifting it out right next to the pupil to get that Azo Yellow color back. So now while I'm waiting for the iris to dry before I put the pupil in, the black pupil, we're going to move on to her nostril. Guess what? We're painting with water, we're dropping in our color, and we're finishing with texture techniques. And in this case, the texture technique is just pulling that water around the hexagonal scales around her nose. So the water already has that beautiful pigment in it. We can add more pigment as we need to. And we're going to pull that colorful water all around the shapes that we drew with our pencil. One note about the tracing too is I would err on the side of tracing it darker versus too light, because it can be hard to see the pencil lines underneath your paint. And I definitely didn't have a problem having too much pencil line. I actually like the pencil line. I think that looks like a cool way to let people in on your process. So anyway, trace darker versus lighter. The other really cool thing about working with a big pool of water, of colorful water, and pulling it around with your brush is that you can add more water or more color or change colors as you go. So you'll see that throughout her body, all her scales, typically the color is changing, even though the lines are all connected. So we're going from yellow to orange to pink to purple, even though all these lines are connected, and it's really easy to do as long as you keep a nice pool of water and keeping those lines, those hexagon shapes, nice and wet. And don't be afraid to put more water. It's not going to go out. It's just going to pool up. You know how water has that surface tension? And I would add more water versus less so you have more time to work with it before it dries. Now I'm going in and softening some edges around the eye and also adding the pupil. It was really important to me to not have any blue in this painting, and usually I put blue in the pupil next to the neutral tint color. So here I did a deep purple instead, obviously saving that white reflection. Now, one thing you'll see with this portrait of Liz is a mix of kind of hard edges and soft edges. In general, to get a hard edge, you're going to be working on dry paper. And to get a soft edge, you're going to be working on wet paper. But you're going to have to play around and test the wetness. Because if you have very wet paper, you will end up getting no edge. The pigment will just spread and spread and spread, and you won't be able to have any kind of edge. But if you get it where it's getting close to being dry, you will be able to still see an edge, but it will be very soft. We're going to get to this later on in the video, but I want you to see these soft shapes up here by the eyes compared to maybe these harder shapes down here. And that all is just the dryness of your paper. So before we add these scaly shapes to Liz's body and mouth area, we're going to want to lay down those base colors of the shadows on her body. So what I'm doing is just getting those shadow areas wet and then dropping in color. And we're moving from that nice bright yellow highlight color all the way down to the deep purple and black shadow color. And now we're already adding some of those softer shapes, kind of giving Liz the illusion of those scales. We're waiting until those shapes are getting close to being dry and then adding in the scale shapes on top of the colorful areas we just painted. And now we get to add the Brusho. This is going to be a lot of fun. And this is why I really like to emphasize less is more, because it's so easy to put some Brusho on there and then be thinking, oh, this is so pretty. I want to put it everywhere. You have to show some restraint. Control yourself. This is fun. So I want to tell you what I like to do is they come in these little jars. And what I do is I don't open them because holy mess. You would just poke a hole in the top, and I also label the top so that I don't have to look at But anyway, if you use them enough, you can tell what color it is anyway. So these shadow areas are still wet, not crazy wet, but wet enough. Practice this if you need to. And then I'm just holding it over there and tapping it. And because it's only coming out of that one tiny hole, it's pretty easy to control. And the other great thing is if this Brusho lands on bone dry paper, you can just blow it off. So you don't have to worry about getting it everywhere. It'll mostly just work in that wet area you just created. So we're putting the yellow Brusho at the top and the black Brusho at the bottom on the body of Liz. So I hardly ever use Brusho, but I'm making a whole video all about it because it is just that cool. And there's not a lot out there that could mimic this effect, that I think it warrants purchasing the supply if you have subjects you paint that would benefit from this effect. When it's fully dry, it can kind of have that look of what salt does to watercolor paper, but it's also colorful. So I think it's a lot better than salt. I actually don't use salt hardly ever now. Now, the other thing with Brusho is that its pigment and the color will grow kind of slowly. So practicing this again will be helpful for you just to understand how much to use. I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, how each Brusho pigment is actually a blend of different colors. And I think that's really cool too, because it's not just a single yellow pigment that you're going to be getting, and it's not a single black pigment. There's actually a lot of color in the black pigment. And it just makes it even more interesting when you apply it to your painting. Here's a close-up of what those brushoed areas looked like when the painting was fully dry. Now, Liz also had some white, lighter spots on her body that I wanted to have show up in that dark, shadowy Brusho area on her body. So what I ended up doing is, while it was still wet and the Brusho had been applied, I went in and dropped some water for water resist. So again, that clear water is going to push the pigment out and make that area in there a little bit lighter. And as it was drying, and once it was fully dried, I continued to make those spots even lighter by lifting some more color out, simply by scrubbing it with a damp brush. Talking more about water resist, this is one of my favorite techniques, and I'm going in and using it even more to create blooms in the shadow areas we just painted. So these shadow areas still are not fully dry, otherwise this wouldn't work. And I'm dropping in plain water with my brush. And that water is pushing the pigment to the edges of the shapes we painted, and it's just making those shapes look more interesting. So technically we're negative painting right now. We're making the positive shapes by painting around them with negative painting. Negative painting is one of the hardest techniques in watercolor, and we're doing a lot of it. So kudos to you. But this is a kind of a nice segue into negative painting because you have outlines to follow from your tracing. But the really cool thing about negative painting is when you combine it with positive shapes. So we're negative painting these scaly shapes, and then we're also painting the positive scales in certain areas around those negative scales. So let me just point this out. These are the negatives because we're painting around them, and then we're going into positives. So these would be positive scales. These are positive scales. I have some positive ones right here, positive ones over here, and then these ones are positive on the eyes. So our positive shapes have a mix of hard and soft edges as well, which also adds interest to the painting. Again, you get the hard edges when your paper is dry, the softer edges when your paper is somewhat wet. So now we're going in and painting those positive scale shapes on the eyes of Liz by first putting down a layer of water, letting that water sink in so the paper isn't soaked. It's just kind of at that matte stage. That's what I like to call it, when the water is soaking in, but it's not dry yet. So this is another element to this, is that your brush wetness should match your paper wetness for this to also be effective. You don't want a brush that's sopping wet with a watery mix of paint, or too dry, because you'll end up just picking up the water off the paper if your brush is too dry. So the wetness of your brush matches the wetness of the paper, but you still have the correct kind of color on your brush too, the amount of pigment that you need. Again, I'm going to tell you that it's probably best to practice this before you try to put it into a painting. The more confident you are with these techniques, the more it will show in your finished paintings. Now, if you're stubborn like me, you're going to just go for it and deal with a subpar painting. I've had so many of those because I hate practicing techniques. I just don't like it. I'd rather risk a failed painting in hopes that maybe my painting will turn out than just practice techniques knowing I'm not even going to get a painting at the end of it. So really, there's no right or wrong way. It's just that confidence piece of you knowing how to do a technique will translate into a successful painting. You'll also see that the eye that's kind of farther away has the purple shadowy color, and the eye that's in the center of the portrait has more of that orangey yellow color. So we're basically done. And that's the really cool thing about the concept of contrast, not only in your lights and darks, but also in your detailed and your blurry areas, is that you just don't have to paint as much, because you want the viewer to fill in the details themselves. So now I'm just going in and making sure my values are right by getting my darkest darks dark, painting another layer of neutral tint or that purple shadowy color where it needs to be. And also, if I need any more highlight color, more yellows or pinks, putting those where they need to go. I went over the scales next to the lips with a little layer of buff titanium. I did some more buff titanium around the eye to emphasize the texture and the dots and scales around her eye. I did some splatter. I only did splatter by hand this time. I'm kind of a messy painter and I always end up having a splatter, like multiple splatters all over my painting anyway. So then I'm just coming in and filling in that splatter where I think it would look good. I'm refining the eye, softening the edges, adding color if I think it needs it. And I usually assign my paintings with an ink pen, but I didn't want that to be so harsh, so I just used a Derwent Inktense pencil in this pretty yellow color instead. Just make sure if you are signing with an Inktense pencil to go over it with a wet brush so it sets it and smooths it out. So we talked about hard and soft edges, positive and negative shapes, choosing our color before we paint, not filling in all the details, letting our viewers do that, and of course using Brusho. And we really talked about showing restraint and less is more. Let me know what else you'd like to see on my YouTube channel in the comments. Let's paint!